thanks you all for coming. My name is Nico Block. I'm one of the organizers with the Socialist Project, and I'm a graduate student at York University. As most of you are, I'm sure, aware, 5 for 15 won a major victory in Ontario in November of last year. It paved the way for paid leave days, fair scheduling rules, equal pay for equal work, and card check and successor rights in certain sectors, which gets into some of the technicalities of union building that I'm personally not an expert on. So maybe you guys can elaborate on that in your talks. So David and Mina are going to talk about what exactly is in Bill 148, how the victory was won, and of course what comes next when it comes to confronting antagonistic employers like Tim Hortons and others. So speaking personally as an outsider to the labor movement, as somebody whose main activist experience is sort of lies elsewhere, there are a couple of things about the Fight for 15 that I just kind of wanted to stress, because they struck me as extremely unique and in some ways kind of groundbreaking. The first of them is that it's a movement that it's a labor movement, but it's extended well beyond the purview of any one particular union, and indeed beyond the purview of unions themselves. The second thing is that Fight for 15, I think, struck a really kind of impressive balance when it came to dealing with the government. I've often thought that that radical social movements, in order to be effective, need to find ways of struggling both through and against the state in certain ways, right? I know certainly that was a balance that we found it difficult to strike in the Quebec student movement, for instance, with which I was involved 5 years ago. So David Bush is an editor at rankandfile.ca, former organizer with the SEIU, and now he's doing his PhD at York in social and political thought, right?
Yeah.
Cool. And obviously he's also an organizer with the Fight for 15. Mina Rajabi she's the president of the York University Graduate Students Association and an organizer with the York Cross Campus Alliance, and she was one of the organizers with the food service workers at York in their struggle for a $15 minimum wage last year. And so I'll let David take it away.
Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly go over sort of what we want. And what we're trying to do with this talk, I guess, is distill 3 years of activity and lessons that we've learned down into a quick little talk. So we're going to be missing things, and we're going to not fully explain things. So I'm really hoping that some of you, if you have questions, you raise them, so we can get more fully into some of the issues that we have come across in our movement. So I'm an organizer with the Fight for 15. I've been involved with the movement for a couple of years. There's many people who've been working on these issues for years and years and years, who've been leaders in our campaign. They mostly come from the Workers' Action Center, and I have to acknowledge, and we acknowledge, that they are really sort of the intellectual and organizational leaders of our movement in terms of laying the groundwork of creating a culture of activism that really allows different people to talk, different people to learn lessons, and express, kind of what, strategy and things like that. So it's a very exciting movement to be a part of. So I just want to talk a little about what we won, why I think that's powerful. The first thing that we want is, this sort of main kind of showcase element is the $15 minimum wage. And we won the fastest timeline in North America to a $15 minimum wage. It goes, it's obviously $14. It went from $11.60 to $14, and then goes up to $15 by January 1st of next year. And so that's a massive 30% increase in the minimum wage. And so that's a lot of money going into low-wage workers' pockets out of business, which is good. We also won job-protected personal emergency leave days. Before the legislation, Bill 148, got passed, 10 Pell days, or personal emergency leave days, were the sort of standard minimum for workplaces above 50 workers. Now that's been given to every single worker in every single workplace, barring some certain kinds of exemptions, auto workers being among them. But that's an expansion of personal emergency leave days. Those are days that you can take for sickness, for family emergency, for your kids' sickness or whatever. And they're very prescriptive, meaning that, like, not prescriptive, meaning that they're very flexible when you can use them, how you can use them. So 1.6 million workers will now have access to those who did not have access to those before Bill 148. And 2 of those days, the first 2, will be paid. And so that makes us the first jurisdiction in Canada with paid sick days, which is a huge victory for workers in this province. We also won equal pay for equal work. This is for part-time, temporary, casual workers, and this is a major victory, and this is coming online this spring, April. And this will be, I think, very radical, and maybe even more radical than we think in terms of leveling people up and getting more money in people's pockets. We can talk more about that. We also won, which comes online next year, fair scheduling provisions, basically the ending of 0-hour contracts. So if you are scheduled for a shift and it gets canceled 48 hours, within 48 hours, you get paid for at least 3 hours. If you're on call and don't get called in, you get paid for at least 3 hours. It's not exactly what we demanded, but it is a significant change compared to what existed beforehand. We also won, extended vacation time, so an extra week's vacation if you've been out of work. So instead of 2 weeks, you get 3 weeks minimum if you've been at a workplace for 5 years. We also won rules around better how holidays calculated, especially for part-time workers. This means more money in the hands of workers. This is actually something that really employers really hate. We also won better language protecting against misclassifying of employers as independent contractors. So the onus is on the employer to actually prove that you are an independent contractor, not on workers. And so obviously we need to test that out in practice and see what that looks like, but that provides a big opening to fight against basically dependent contractors, kind of stuff like Uber and things like that. Better rules governing temp agencies. We also saw, extension of card-based certification to, and this is sector specific, so building services, home care, temp agencies, community services. We'll now see the expansion of card check certification, making it easier to organize in the sector. So building services, that's a huge win, and that can really sort of help increase the density in that sector. And also, successor rights have been won, and this is sectoral specific, but it's something that we can build off of. And then there was also, on top of Bill 148, though not in it, there was, a promise by the Liberal government to hire 175 employment standards officers by 2021. Now that's a long way from now, but that is a significant increase relative to the amount of employment standards officers now. And there's also, a plan to increase the enforcement, so have 90% of workplaces visited within whatever amount of time, I forget, increasing the amount of fines and make it easier to collect owed money from employers. Those things, added together means Bill 148 is a very significant win. And so where did that come from? That came from, the longer trajectory of that is that this comes from years and years of organizing by people from the Workers' Action Center, parts of the labor movement and community groups, the fight for the $10 minimum wage, the fight for the $14 minimum wage, fights against wage theft, fights against getting legislation around tip theft, all passed in the years before 2014. And those networks really laid the foundation for what this campaign became and where it was going. And so the political context, if we remember, is that the Liberal government was quite weak, had been quite weak from, it was in a minority position before 2014. There was a campaign to raise the minimum wage that was to $14. And it really pushed on the Liberals. They said, no, not really. The NDP didn't really support it. But that was also on the back of a huge employer offensive that was taking place in the wake of the Great Recession. So from 2009 to 2012-13, there was major attacks on unions right across the board, especially in Ontario. We're talking about Valet, where you're talking about EMT in London, whether you're talking about Stelco and Hamilton. These were or CN Rail with the Teamsters. This was huge rollbacks, attacks of pensions, working conditions, right across the board, and unions were losing. And on top of that, unions were losing in conditions where the broader working class was getting hammered. We saw major layoffs, and we saw the increase of precarious employment right across the board, and we saw basically years and years of stagnant wages for workers, and workers basically trying to increase and fighting, but really, the Harris cuts and the recession working together made it like very precarious employment was growing at a huge rate. And there was a growing gap between what the ESA standard was and where unions were. And so unions trying to go out in bargaining and ask for more, it was this huge gap to try to win public support when unions were so far ahead of where other non-unionized workers, the other 70% or more of the population, it was very hard to make gains. And the campaign to raise the minimum wage to $14, it didn't win, but it did win a couple things. It won a 75-cent increase to the minimum wage, and won Bill 18, which was basically a success in terms of tying the minimum wage to inflation. So every October, the minimum wage was getting revisited and adjusting upwards. So what we've actually won right now in this province is minimum wage plus, which means that the minimum wage will keep getting readjusted, as long as we don't suffer major political rollbacks. We have minimum wage plus as of right now. And so the other thing that was won from that campaign was a promise of labor law reform, and this is the Changing Workplaces Review. And there was a promise to look at both the Labor Relations Act, the Employment Standards Act in Ontario, and review all this in the wake of growing precarious employment. And the campaign to raise the minimum wage, which was centered around WAC and its allies, kind of went through a consultation phase where workers were at the center of that, talking about, what do we do with this? How do we organize around this? How do we use this political opening to actually push for the things that we need, push building a movement? What do we want? What's going to make our lives better? And they settled on issues, and people ask, where do these demands come from? These demands come from that process of workers talking about what they need, what they think that they can fight for and achieve that's going to be achievable, where they can get concrete victories, but also issues that are inspiring enough to be actually organized around. So those are the kinds of two tensions that were being at play with those workers, right? Which is like, what are we going to actually fight for? What are we going to get in the streets for? And then also, what can we actually strategically make gains for in the here and now? And so that kind of tension. But it was not done by policy wonks. It wasn't done by academics. It wasn't done by politicians. It wasn't done by people on the sideline. That's not who made those demands, but it was the workers themselves kind of thinking about, what they can achieve. And they also looked at the Fight for 15 in the United States, which started in 2012 in New York City by the SEIU, kind of understanding that what the $15 minimum wage started to symbolize there in that growing campaign, which saw major victories in SeaTac and Seattle, achieved $15 minimum wage. We can hitch our wagon to that and also think about internationalizing our movement. So that's sort of where that came from. And the idea was, like people like Dina Ladd, Pam Frake, America Latley, the Workers' Action Center, was to think about employment standards reform as collective bargaining for non-unionized workers. And that's how we have to treat it, and that's how we have to organize around. And so that was the sort of general sort of theory of the organizing work that was going into it. And that's sort of where we came to the Fight for 15 and fairness.
Okay. Dave is not done. He'll be back. So just to reiterate what Dave said at the very beginning, I'm going to touch on a little bit about how we got here, what was some of the work that the campaign did and the different organizers involved with the campaign and Workers' Action Center did to get us to this point. But there's no way that we can touch on every single milestone and every single action that the campaign had. This is a very busy campaign, a lot of people involved. There rarely goes a month or even a week when there's not something going on somewhere, an action, a protest, something related to the 15 Unfairness campaign. So I'm just going to try to highlight some of the work that we did and touch on some of the points of strength that the campaign had and what helped us to get to this point. As Dave said, in April 2015, that was when the campaign was officially launched. 15 Unfairness started with the 26 demands. And from the outset, the campaign was very much led and directed by the workers. A lot of workers in the province, especially marginalized workers, racialized workers, indigenous workers, people who were at the very sort of the peripheries of the labor and with the most precarious positions, found a voice and a space in this campaign and started joining it. And the initial goal of the campaign from the very beginning was legislative reform. We wanted to see those changes, but the idea was never to stop there. That was just one step. That was one goal for the campaign. And we were not going to, the point was not to only focus on lobbying and achieve legislative reforms that way, but rather to use lobbying as only one tool among many other tools that the campaign had and could use in order to build a strong base and a solid workers' movement in the province, and to sort of fill in the gaps where between the union workers and the official labor movement and the non-unionized workers and people who did not identify with the labor movement, or who could not find spaces for themselves and for their voices to be heard. So that was sort of where the campaign was situated and how the work of the campaign started. And this work, the work of organizing and building this broader base and a strong workers' movement was done through months and months of petitioning, thousands of one-on-one conversations, street outreach, using different tools that we had in our quiver, phone banking, using online tools, using different provincial and local events. And in doing this work, as sort of Dave touched on that, the $15 minimum wage became an important tool. Because it was not originally in the scope of the Changing Workplaces Review, but this was a demand that the workers wanted to push for, because it was very much understood that raising minimum wage was an important first step in order to start to close that inequality gap in the province, and also to start moving towards eradicating precarity in Ontario. And that was what the workers wanted to do, and that was what they were willing to fight for. So $15 an hour, raising minimum wage, was very much part of the conversation from the very beginning. And it was also a pretty straightforward demand. So in our organizing, fighting for raising minimum wage was something that everyone understood and a lot of people identified with. So it had broad class appeal. Every single sector, every single region that you went to, this was something that people immediately responded to. So that gave us a very strong tool for starting the conversation, for attracting people to the campaign, and for creating that strong base that then we could use to lend support to all the other demands that we had in the campaign and all the other ESA changes. Because the other demands were not, as you appreciate, they're not as straightforward as raising minimum wage. There are more nuances, there are more sort of technical aspects to them. They are for sure as important, if not more important than raising minimum wage, but they just don't have that, they couldn't be understood as straightforward and as sort of readily understandable as a minimum wage. So $15 an hour became through the symbol of the campaign and a very important tool in that sense. So the first 2 years of the campaign, 2015 and 2016, was very much focused on this community building. And in doing so, we had so many different chapters of the campaign and so many different local groups starting all over Ontario. We had chapters starting in Hamilton, Kingston, Guelph, London, Sudbury, so many other towns. as well as chapters starting in different sectors. So a lot of campuses started joining 15 and Fairness. We had 15 and Fairness chapters in most Ontario universities and some colleges. And then in each campus, there was also a coalition of different unions and campus groups joining the campaign. We had 15 and Fairness chapters starting in the health sector. We had the faith community joining the campaign. So I think it was 125 faith leaders that signed a letter of support for the campaign. Parkdale Community Legal Clinic, the Ontario Network of Injured Workers, the Chinese Workers Network, the Center for Spanish-Speaking People, and so many other provincial and local groups that started joining the campaign. And the important point to make here is that the campaign never went out there and to try to target certain communities or certain towns to start chapters from bottom up. It was the other way around. So we had a lot of workers, a lot of activists and community leaders and organizers joining the campaign and then starting chapters in whatever community they were in, or in whatever workplace they were at, or in whatever university they studied in. So this was very organic. We had all the chapters that we had started in the campaign was very much decided on and started by people who joined the campaign on a volunteer basis. And this created a very interesting dynamic in the campaign, where the Workers' Action Center was sort of the hub, if you will, of the campaign. This was the place where we made most of our material, where a lot of our organizers and leaders were housed in, where our spokespeople were at, and where all of our other chapters were reporting to and sort of coordinating with. But at the same time, the campaign was in nature very much diversified and decentralized. So there was never a top-down approach in this campaign of a central body deciding on things and strategizing and then letting other people know what to do. But it was very much always an interaction, and every single member of the campaign had a voice, and they could participate in at the very highest level in how to strategize and how to make decisions on where the campaign was going and how we plan things. And our meeting styles and our coordination model helped a lot with this dynamic. The campaign had from the get-go, we had monthly provincial calls as well as citywide meetings in every single city where the campaign had a chapter. And the way these meetings were organized were that they would start with the campaign giving an update as to where the campaign was at, what are some of the things that are happening around the campaign, what are some of the things that we need to be ready about, so that everyone was on the same page as to where the campaign was. And then we would move into a discussion on strategies and planning and what are the possible things that a campaign needs to do and where we need to take it. And then finish with every single chapter and every single local or provincial group reporting back to the campaign. So that everyone knew, even though all of the different actions and the different plans were happening at the local levels and people had authority over what they got to do in their communities. And it was very different in different towns and in different groups, and very much based on different groups' capacity, energy, membership level, what they had going on in their community. So it was never a consistent form of actions across the board. But we were always in the loop as to what other people are doing, what are some of the highlights of what's happening elsewhere, and trying to get inspiration from different groups as well. This was all done with very few resources. This campaign, compared to the amount of work that has gone into it and what it has achieved, it was from the very beginning very, I would say, lowly resourced. We did have donations from major unions and from different groups, but so comparing it to the Fight for 15 campaign in the US that had, I think it was like $20 million funding per year from SEIU. This is not compared. So But it was, in a way, a strength point as well, because it meant that the campaign was only as strong as the energy of the workers that were involved in it and their capacity and their passion and excitement for the work that they did. I mean, we could all agree that that went so far, right? Because of this, again, as I mentioned, this network that the campaign created and this structure, one thing that was from the very beginning an important focus was that every single person joining the campaign was supposed to be trained so that they were informed as to what the demands of the campaign were, skills as to how to do outreach for the campaign, but also to sharpen their skills and to gain analysis and to be able to explain and analyze the different demands. And quickly touch on two things. So the Workers' Action Center, that was sort of that centralized hub for the campaign, they started a program called Feet on the Ground early on in the campaign. And within that program, the Workers' Action Center trained 32 participants from 7 different communities in Ontario, paying them a small stipend and having them go through a round of training to build their organizing skills and to also teach them about some of the sort of the basics of the campaign, the ESA history, the context of the ESA and ESA changes, and what they could do going back to their communities to organize for the campaign. And that was a very important round of training, because all of these workers who went through that training are now great organizers in the Workers' Action Center and people who are playing a huge role in the campaign. But it was also, aside from that training, at every step of the way, training and informing the members was prioritized by the campaign to make sure that people were equipped with proper analysis and a proper understanding of where the campaign was at every single step, to be able to argue on behalf of the campaign. So a lot of times you see campaign models where the strategizing and the analysis happens at the very top. You have a small group of people who are leading the campaign, who are doing all of that work, and then the rest of the people involved in the campaign are just involved in outreach. And this was a model that 15 Fairness defied from the very beginning. And we wanted to make sure that we are carrying people with us throughout the whole process, that every single person joining the campaign was being informed at every single step, was being invited to be part of the strategizing work of the campaign. The other thing, so aside from all of this organizing and mobilizing on the ground and that work, I also wanted to quickly touch on the bargaining support work that the campaign did. So a lot of what we achieved was through that direct organizing in different communities and organizing with non-unionized workers. But also an important part of the campaign since the very beginning was to push for our different unions and our different unionized workers to bargain for 15M fairness. So up until we would get that legislative reform, to have different unions who were either had workers who were making under $15 an hour, or had collective agreements that did not have all the provisions that the campaign was demanding for, to start bargaining for these things under the umbrella of 15M fairness. And so in summer of 2016, we had 2 major victories. One was the Unifor 414, which is the union representing the Metro grocery store workers. They had an unprecedented contract won for their workers that guaranteed hours of work for their workers, and also created a number of guaranteed new positions in their collective agreement. And then later that year, in July, we had QP 1989, which is the union representing the Mississauga library workers. That union also, after a fairly short strike, so a 17-day strike, they won $15 an hour for all of their workers, and a wage increase for everyone who was part of that union. So these are the first couple of rounds of bargaining that had demands of 15M fairness incorporated in their bargaining demands. And then moving into 2017, that's when we had the York food service workers strike. So in February 2017, the food service workers at York University, which is a group of about 160 workers, members of Unite Here Local 75, who work for Aramark, but on York campus, went on strike. Now, month and month before that strike, so starting about in mid to late summer, when bargaining had started, a lot of us who were at York were hearing from the union and from other allies on campus that there's a good chance that these workers would have to go on strike because there are so many issues at their workplace, including workers being paid poverty wages, but also a lack of respect at work, racial discrimination, many cases of Islamophobia. We had workers who ended up during that strike becoming strong leaders in their union, who Malka, one of our great leaders and organizers who came out of that union, is a Muslim woman. She has a university degree from back home from Pakistan, had worked at Aramark for a number of years and was told again and again that she could not get a promotion, she could not get promoted because she wears a hijab and she's not presentable. So there were so many cases of blatant cases of Islamophobia and racial discrimination and just unfair layoffs and disrespectful treatment of workers in that union. And unfortunately, once bargaining started, Aramark was not responding to the workers at all. So at every single step, with every single demand that they had, they were being told that no, we're just going to keep the status quo, and you're a small union on a campus of about 60,000 people. No one really cares about you. So even if you go on strike, we don't care, and certainly the community won't care. So we had a number of different groups on York University campus, but especially the 15 and Fairness chapter at York University, which was one of our strongest chapters in the campus sector in 15 and Fairness, starting to mobilize and organize for these workers at York. And Unite Here Local 75, the union representing the food service workers, made a decision later in the fall, which I think was a very critical and a smart decision, to incorporate some of the demands of 15 and Fairness into their bargaining. So they started bargaining for a $15 minimum wage. They started bargaining for 7 paid sick days, for fair scheduling, for respect at work. So the demands of the union became the demands of the campaign, and that gave us a huge opening for organizing solidarity efforts. And it was 15 and Fairness at York, working with what is known as the York Cross Campus Alliance, which is an alliance of different labor unions at York University, representing students, faculty, teaching assistants, security, staff, and all the different workers at York University. So that alliance started mobilizing and organizing solidarity efforts in support of these workers. We had, for a few months before they went on strike, we had rallies planned, we had days of tabling and petitioning in support of these workers. So when February hit and they actually went on strike, most of the people on campus knew what these demands were and knew what the conditions of work of these workers were. And when the workers did go on strike, again, this group was ready to hit the ground. We initially, when the workers went on strike, their employer, Aramark, threatened that they would keep all the stores open and just bring in temp agency workers or bring in their managers. They won't care if they go on strike. We knew it was a bit of a bluff, and only a couple of the stores could stay open. But this coalition of the Cross Campus Alliance and 15 and Fairness at York managed to, even for the 2 locations that were open, to fund a full day of offering free coffee. So we had volunteers stationed at these 2 locations offering free coffee all day, and we had volunteers of 15 and Fairness coming in, leafletting people, letting them know what was going on with these workers, and also just offering them free coffee instead of having them go buy one at Tim Hortons, which was I think it was a Tim Hortons and a Starbucks that were open. And so this was how we kept escalating as that strike went on. We had all of our volunteers on campus every single week, petitioning, talking to students, talking to community members. We used all of our online tools and made a few videos. We had a website put up where people could send in letters to Aramark and to York administration asking to end this strike. And I think we had about 3,000 letters submitted just the first week that the website went on. And towards the very end, there was a campus visit day that York University had. One of those, they invite prospective students and their families to come in and visit the campus. And we organized our own events for those days, for that weekend. And one of our tech-savvy people also did a website for us that mimicked the website that York University had, and that had all the scheduling for the campus visit days. It was very much the same, except for the fact that ours, instead of York University or Experience York University, ours said Experience York University on strike, and had all of that information. And that was sort of the last straw. When that website, I think it was launched at 7 a.m. in the morning, the day before those campus visits were scheduled, and later that night at about like 9 or 10 p.m., the union got a call from Aramark saying, come, we want to bargain. And the very first thing we heard, they were told, was that cancel that website, cancel those plans, and we will bargain. And they did, and they got almost every single demand that they had. And following that, at the very same time that York was on strike, U of T food service workers were in Scarborough were on strike as well. They were also Aramark employees. And once the strike at York was done and the workers got a contract there, Aramark also gave a similar contract to the U of T ones. And then a month later, again, Aramark workers at Rogers Centre, and that's a huge local, so we're talking about thousands of workers there. They were also up to negotiate their collective agreement, and there they didn't even need to go on strike. Aramark just gave the workers what they wanted because they were so scared of yet another strike. Bargaining 15 and fairness became an important part of the campaign in 2016-2017, and especially the food service workers' wins. Those are major wins in that sector. A lot of those wins and a lot of the things that the workers got were unprecedented in the hospitality and food service sector. And they were also important wins for the campaign because they helped a lot in raising the confidence of all of our organizers and all of us who were part of the campaign, because people were now starting to see, oh, $15 an hour is winnable. Workers are winning it here and there and in different locations, so we could do this. So that gave an extra level of encouragement to everyone who was part of the campaign. End of March, our campaign had a provincial strategy meeting, a 2-day event with all of our organizers coming to Toronto for a strategy meeting. We had amazing turnout and there was a lot of especially after the strikes, the momentum was definitely there, and there was a lot of push for the final stage of the Changing Workplaces review. People wanted to see the changes that they were advocating for and looking for in that. And then it was less than a month after that meeting, so May 30th, that the government came out and announced that they were going to introduce changes to the Employment Standards Act, and they were including, even though it wasn't in the scope in the first place, they were including a $15 minimum wage with an 18-month phase-in in the legislation that they were going to table, which, as Dave said, was the fastest phase-in in all of North America, an 18-month one. The campaign celebrated that. It was a big win, but we also knew that the business lobby was not going to just sit idly by and let it happen. And that summer became very critical. So summer of 2017, we escalated our organizing. People were energized by Bill 148 and the fact that their efforts had gotten us to that point. And then, of course, we also had so much pushback from the business lobby, from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and we had to really fight over the next few months to make sure that Bill 148, the legislation would stay the same and or get improved by fall, when the legislature would open again and the House would vote on it, and that it wouldn't get watered down over the next few months because of the pushback from the business lobby. So the first round of hearings happened in July. We had, and you probably hear this maybe here and there, a lot of people who speak against Bill 148 and the ESA changes talk about how, oh, the Liberal government did not consult anyone. There was no consultation. This was just a unilateral decision made. There was so much consultation. The problem for them was that we outnumbered the other side. We outnumbered the business lobby at every single hearing and at every single round of consultation. We managed to get all of the different groups involved with the campaign and all of the different allies to submit written submissions or to come out and do presentations in front of the committee. So we did that over the summer. Unfortunately, there were a few clawbacks and changes made, amendments made to the bill after the second hearing, especially around scheduling and equal pay measures, which are the two areas that we were pushing for. So again, in between July, the second round of hearings, and the last round of hearings in the fall, we had our members just go out petitioning, postering, meeting with MPPs, asking for equal pay and for scheduling to be fixed. And we managed to get that done. So the third round of hearing, again, we outnumbered the business side in those hearings, and we had hundreds of submissions to the committee, and we managed to, by the time Bill 148 actually passed, the language for equal pay was tightened. It's not ideal yet, but we managed to tighten the language a little bit. Same with scheduling. And the hearings and the submissions were closed on November 3rd, and November 22nd, Bill 148 passed. And I think Dave's going to touch on what next.
I've been part of a lot of different campaigns over the years, and this campaign is a little different, as in we've won the promise of legislation. We won a piece of legislation, and we continue to keep organizing because we understand that the legislation is really significant. It's really impactful for workers, and it's very good, but it's not perfect. It's not everything that we've asked for or demanded. You compare the legislation to our list of demands, and there's definitely a lot of places that come up short that we can keep organizing around. And we also understand that the way in which parts of the business lobby and businesses have been responding to some of this legislation, that we can really tighten up on things like enforcement. We can also tighten up on stuff like when employers are cutting back paid breaks. Well, wait a second, maybe that should be in the ESA, right, rather than leaving it up to employers to take away. So we don't technically have 15 and fairness yet, right? Like we don't technically have a $15 minimum wage. It's in the legislation, but we know that we're coming up to an election on June 7th, and we don't have, it could radically change. Our political situation could radically change. We could see rollbacks. We could see parts of the bill that haven't been implemented yet, from scheduling to the $15 minimum wage, be just totally stopped dead in their tracks. And we have to understand that, it's like a video game, right? Like we've conquered the first level, right? And we're just kicking ass. And we kick the business lobby's ass. Like that's the number one thing. But we've really gone up a level. And when you go up a level in a video game, you go up to boss level. And we are at boss level, peak boss level, right? So the business lobby, employers, individual employers are coming out of the woodworks and attacking this bill. They're supported by a whole intellectual layer of jerks, from the Fraser Institute, from TD Bank, economists or whatever, trying to give intellectual cover to rolling back workers' wages, to stopping the workers' gains. And we know that the business lobby, formed this super group of villains in July 2016, known as Keep Ontario Working. So it was like the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, who's super bad, and then it hooks up with the agricultural lobby, and then also Restaurants Canada, and they form a super group, and they're terrible. And they started mobilizing around these issues, and they mobilized around these issues by also doing their own town halls for local chamber of commerce, and trying to whip up the business lobby to oppose what's coming down the pipes. And they've been doing that for the last year. They also have been funding research to get economic reports. A lot of those came down the pipes in September and October, saying there's going to be massive job loss. There's going to be, and the numbers vary, right there. 90,000 jobs are going to be lost. 60,000 jobs are going to be lost. 140,000 jobs are going to be lost if you go and make a $15 minimum wage. And so we had to develop the intellectual tools to fight back against that, and also, the networks to be able to say, to transmit that message to all our different activists who can actually go out and defend this. If you're paying attention to the news, you saw January's job numbers, right? You saw in Ontario lost 51,000 jobs in January. Like, holy shit, this looks like fire and brimstone for workers in this province. And that's how it was reported. That's what the news looked like. And those were the headlines. Except when we actually dig down a little in the numbers, we see that, well, actually those are part-time jobs being lost in places like construction, in places like healthcare, and for professionals. So like lawyers are losing their jobs. Boo-hoo. But a whole bunch of full-time jobs are being created. And in a way, this was about conversion of part-time work into full-time work. But it's not just 1 month, a snapshot of 1 month. From December had a huge jobs boom. And this is a sort of slowly little backstep in January. But if you go year to year, we're talking about a massive job growth in this province. We're talking about unemployment rate that keeps falling. We're talking about hours of work going up, and we're talking about more money in workers' pockets. It's actually a very good scenario, and the jobs report is actually very good if you actually look at the numbers. And this is something that a couple of the Financial Post and a couple other sort of more right-wing economic-y kind of papers and analysts said, well, yeah, actually, minimum wage doesn't have anything to do with this. But that was not the front page of the CBC, front page of the Toronto Star, or whatever. And so we have to be able to fight against this, because that's what we're up against. And we saw a big taste of that in January. In January, the minimum wage and a whole bunch of these new rules, except for scheduling and equal pay for equal work, came into effect on January 1. By January 4th, we had Tim Hortons cutting back paid breaks, a major, huge wave of employers outright assaulting the rights of workers, and workers kind of don't know what to do. And this sort of headline after headline after headline in the first 10 days of January, I've never seen anything like it, talking about workers' rights, right? Where you actually had the Premier, Kathleen Wynne, who's no friend of workers, coming out and saying, I hate the bully bosses at Tim Hortons, I don't attack Tim Hortons workers, you can attack me, etc. Comrade Wynne. And it was weird, because it was led by, the ground zero was Tim Hortons. It became symbolized, this attack that was happening at different places like Sunset Grill. Metro Grocery said, we're cutting back 24-hour grocery stores. All sorts of wage theft, cutting paid breaks, cutting uniform, messing with tip pools. All these things started to come out in the open. And there was a question of which way could this go? This could be really, really bad, where workers lose a lot of confidence. Workers, the lesson that they draw from this is that, we tried to have a higher minimum wage and better working standards, but the lesson is it's not working, hours are being cut, or it's not worth it, we should never really fight for anything more, etc. And so the person leading the charge was this guy, Ron Joyce Jr., and his wife, who is also heir, there are two heirs of the Tim Hortons. From Joyce and Tim Hortons, they married and created some weird family. But they have millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And they cut their workers' paid breaks. And while they were on, they sent a memo from their Florida vacation home and said, we're cutting our employees' paid breaks. And this sort of outraged people, And our job in the 15 Fairness campaign, I think what we realized that there was this moment that we needed to organize around, to be able to take some of this backlash and direct it into say, you know what, we can actually organize and defend some of these achievements that we've had, and also trying to draw wider lessons, right? And push back against the idea that there's no way workers can make gains. And so a series of protests were organized, all within, like 24-hour, 48-hour notice. Like, so on January 10th, there was within 17 protests right across the province in Ontario, organized most of them within 36 hours. And we had protests here in Toronto that were like 200 people at one Tim Hortons or 100 people at another. We had 60, 70 people at Dufferin and Bloor at 8 a.m. like within 24 hours. And it was an amazing kind of outpouring, showcasing. We were getting a lot of support from passers-by. We were getting workers coming out of their stores and saying, this is happening to me too. We were going in there and trying to rattle the cages of Tim Hortons and say that there is, direct some of this anger and steam into actual organization. And that was followed by another day of action that turned out to be national on January 19th, where we had 50 actions right across the country. And it was actually a great way to also think about reviving or connecting the Fight for 15 and fairness here with other burgeoning Fight for 15 movement. So Nova Scotia is relaunching their Fight for 15 movement. Manitoba also wants to get a Fight for 15 movement. And so this is like kind of creating infrastructure for them to jump on board and do that organizing. And this is something that, my mom is not she voted for a union, but is like kind of also a Tory voter, right? And so she lives hours north of here. And she was even outraged. Tim Hortons and all her old lady friends, they're all drink McDonald's coffee. They all did it. And then and my mom would ask them, why are you drinking McDonald's coffee? She says, oh yeah, because of Tim Hortons. And then she's like, yeah, of course. And so it's the extent that this had reached far down, very deep into Tory country, that was a sure sign that this was really, really something that there was a really bad misstep on parts of the employers. Even though they were trying to, strike fear, it turned out to be kind of a ricochet back in their face. And that was a very good thing. But it really comes down to this, is that we need to be able to defend the gains that we have, right? If we're going to go out and ask for more, if we're going to go out and build a movement that says we demand more and more and more, which we should, which we are, we need to be able to defend what we have. If we can't defend what we have, we can't get more. And so we have to be able to build movements. And so this is about fighting, fighting against bully bosses on a local level, but also fighting for the best interpretation of what the Employment Standards Act looks like. We need to look at all the different ways employers are trying to skirt the law, trying to pull one over on workers. And we need to be able to channel that into, some of the demands that we want to go for. Again, like something like paid breaks, stuff like that. And so I think this is really important because we are 100 days away from the election, right? Today is 100 days from the election, and it's a fairly significant election. And I just want to sort of outline kind of where the parties are and then where our movement is, and then we can maybe all... Yeah. So I just want to say, the way we view political parties is this, right? From what I think is sort of classic sort of what MLK, kind of quoted Walter Reuther, our idea of power. Idea of power is to say, we're trying to make the government in power who wants to say no to something, say yes to something. So when we went and lobbied and talked to the Liberals early on, organized lobby days, and we go in there with our activists and say, we demand this. And they say, minimum wage is out of scope, we already dealt with that. No. See you later. Talk about something else. And to the point where we built enough popular support that forced the Liberal government to say yes to something. Obviously they're opportunists. Obviously they're going to move where the wind is blowing, and we blew them off course. Okay, and that was a very good thing for us. But parties like the NDP, which sort of formally adopted some of the Fight for 15 and fairness positions in their platform, right? So they supported $15 minimum wage a year after our campaign launched in April 2016. They also supported parts of the labor law, tabling legislation that got voted down, but they never really became a megaphone for the movement. They never really amplified our demands. They never really led with them. They never were seen as a champion for the fight for union fairness. And so when the Liberals tacked position and moved over, because we had created popularity for our demands, right? Like, so in the GTA, $15 minimum wage is supported like by 70%, across the province by 60%. Majority of small business owners support a $15 minimum wage. This is like, we were killing it. And so Liberals are obviously, going in the tank and looking for what's popular, and so they moved over there. The NDP got caught flat-footed, and their response was the Liberals stole our ideas. And I'm like, yeah, they stole your small business tax cut. And so I think, and it's sort of symbolized, I look at like some of the ways in which they set their campaign relaunch last Friday with the Change for the Better speech. I don't know, it's supposed to change for the worse, I'm not sure what that's about. But Change for the Better speech, in which they outlined some of their priorities, right? It gave us a flavor for what their election is going to look like, and it was about hydro prices, it was about public services, so pharmacare and healthcare spending, and they've had one, 15-minute, 13-minute speech. They had one word about work, which was like a better work-life balance. That's it. They didn't even say that these are our ideas. They didn't lead with them. They didn't try to polarize along class demands. They left that up to like Comrade Wynne, essentially. And I'll give you an example quickly. This is an email from the Liberals. I'll read you two emails. It's exactly 100 days. In exactly 100 days, voters will head to the polls to determine Ontario's future. We all know as Liberals, I'm not Liberal, there's so much at stake, all of the progress we have made together so far, and all the plans we have for a fair and better future. Whether we're talking about a plan for the economy, healthcare, blah, blah, blah. So, and it's why we're fighting for the mom and dad who work two jobs and are still struggling to make ends meet by raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Because in a province as prosperous as Ontario, no one who works full-time should worry about their next meal, where their next meal is coming from. Okay, so this is the email from the NDP. Dear David, hey, you should really donate $5 and we'll match it with another $5. If you don't, our office dog Bandit won't get walked. All right? I don't know. That's it. Like, those are they're not polarizing on class issues, they're not leading with them. Yes, their platform is better, but if you get the communications from both, the idea is that the NDP is devoid of actual political content. And it's a problem. I'm not saying that the NDP's formal positions, they're actually better. But it's how they're communicating it and how they're talking about it that I think is important for how workers are seeing the parties, right? And then in the Tory party, which is total train wreck, but is somehow leading in the polls. It's leading in the polls according to campaign research, which is a bit higher than Forum. I think, no, it's Forum. Forum is a bit higher than campaign research. The Tories are like doing quite well. They're actually in a majority in Toronto. That's how well they're doing. Now, we don't know. I don't suspect that will hold. But the point is that they're in crisis. Their formal position under Patrick Brown was a $15 minimum wage by 2022. They didn't feel confident enough to outright oppose a $15 minimum wage. That tells us something. But we do have two candidates who outright, or two or three candidates who I think outright oppose a minimum wage who are running for Tory party leadership. Doug Ford outright opposes a $15 minimum wage. He says like $14, I won't roll it back, but I'll give tax cuts instead. And then Christine Elliott was like, I'll eventually raise it to 15 when the economy's better. No real measure. Obviously, they're not going to do this stuff. In practice, we know when the Tories get elected, there's a good chance, they're not just going to stop things in the track, like the scheduling provision, but they could even roll back things like equal pay for equal work. They could roll back parts of the other ESA, because they did that before. They've done that. They did that in the 90s. It was brutal, and there's no question about it. But we know that $15 minimum wage inside the Tory party has a huge percentage of support, not just like marginal, and we're talking about like 40% supported on the timeline that exists now. That's massive. And so they know their own internal polling. They know that this is a popular issue. So how they talk about it and how they can oppose it, as long as we are able to, keep building on the issue, keep talking to, like building a base of support and building popularity for these issues, I think is our best bet. And so I had a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm just going to cut it short and just say, our vision for this is like after the election, we're going to have a demonstration in June. We're going to have a protest in June talking about the need for 15 fairness, talking about these issues along a class line, the need for decent work, no matter who wins. If the NDP wins, the Liberals win, the Tories win, our idea is that we need to keep creating a pull to push whoever's in power. I have a whole lot of other things, but I think that's just sort of where I'll end.